The boy's hands were buried to the wrists in cool, dark mud, a sensation so impossible in the cracked, sun-baked desert of New Mexico that he was certain it was a fever dream. For 3 days, thirst had been a physical tormentor, splitting his lips, clouding his vision and turning his tongue to sandpaper. Now a small, miraculous pool of water bubbled up from the parched earth, where he had frantically dug. He didn't hesitate. Ezekiel plunged his face into the spring, drinking with a desperation that bordered on violence, gulping down the life-giving liquid until his stomach cramped and ached in protest. The relief was so absolute, so overwhelming, that he collapsed onto the wet ground beside the water, and the sobs that racked his small 10-year-old frame were not of sorrow, but of a gratitude so profound it felt like a holy presence settling over him. He wasn't just saved, he had been answered. This is a story about a faith pushed to its absolute limit, and the quiet miracles that can bloom in the harshest of landscapes. If you believe that stories of resilience and hope are more important now than ever, please take a moment to leave a like and consider subscribing to our channel. We are building a community of listeners who appreciate deep, meaningful narratives, and we would be honored to know where you are joining us from today. Let us know in the comments. Your presence here makes these stories possible, and this is a journey you will want to see through to its powerful conclusion. I promise you that. But this moment of salvation was not the beginning of Ezekiel's trial. It was the end of it. To understand the impossible weight of those tears, and to grasp why the discovery of simple water felt like a direct response from a God he was beginning to doubt, we must travel back 3 agonizing days. We must return to a desolate expanse of rock and creosote, to the moment a powerful man left a small boy utterly alone, armed with nothing but a nearly empty canteen and a chilling pronouncement that was meant to be a death sentence. It all began when Judge Blackwood decided that a child's life was worth less than the land beneath his feet. Ezekiel James Thornton was 10 years old, but in the weeks following the flood, he felt he had aged 100 years. His new world was one of suffocating silence, a stark and cruel contrast to the life he had known. Before, his days were filled with the sound of his father's booming voice practicing sermons and his mother's gentle humming as she worked. Now the only consistent sound in the grand, empty house of Judge Blackwood was the funereal ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking a second of his isolation. He was a small, quiet boy, with his father's dark hair and his mother's observant eyes, and those eyes now saw a world drained of color and warmth. He lived in a guest room at the back of the house, a space as sterile and impersonal as a hotel, where the air was always cool and smelled faintly of lemon oil and disuse. This was not a home, it was a holding cell, and Ezekiel was its sole, silent prisoner. The memory of the accident was a recurring nightmare that ambushed him in the quiet moments of the day. He would be staring at the polished floorboards and suddenly see the churning brown water of the arroyo, swollen and furious from the flash flood. He would hear the terrible crack of splintering wood as the bridge gave way, a sound like the sky itself breaking apart. The image of the wagon, his parents inside, tipping and then vanishing into the violent current, was burned into his mind. He had been standing on the opposite bank, helpless, his own small shouts swallowed by the roar of the water. He remembered the feeling of utter powerlessness, the cold rain plastering his hair to his scalp, and the chilling realization that he was completely and irrevocably alone. That moment had been the end of his childhood, the final closing of a door to a life of safety and love. Judge Blackwood was the architect of his new, cold reality. A man of 50, with a severe face framed by graying sideburns and a mouth that seemed incapable of a genuine smile, he moved through his home with an air of absolute authority. He was a pillar of the church, his voice resonating with piety on Sundays, but during the week, his eyes held a different kind of fire, one of cold calculation. He rarely spoke directly to Ezekiel, and when he did, his words were clipped and formal, addressing him as the boy. There was no comfort in his presence, only a pervasive sense of being watched and evaluated. Ezekiel felt like a piece of property the judge had reluctantly acquired, an inconvenient complication in a much larger, unseen transaction. The man's hands were clean and his clothes immaculate, but the boy sensed a deep and profound stain on his soul. The house itself was an extension of the judge's personality. It was a place of dark wood, heavy drapes, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors who stared down with disapproving eyes. Every surface was polished to a high sheen, reflecting a distorted, lonely image of the small boy who walked its halls. There were no scuff marks on the floor, no books left open, no sign that life was actually lived within its walls. It was a monument to order and control, a place where emotion was an unwelcome guest. The silence was so profound that Ezekiel's own breathing often sounded jarringly loud to him. He missed the comfortable clutter of his own home, the smell of his mother's baking and the sight of his father's books stacked in precarious towers. Here, there was only the cold, unyielding presence of wealth and power, a world in which he had no place. His days fell into a monotonous, isolating rhythm. He ate his meals alone at one end of a long mahogany dining table, the judge seated at the other, hidden behind a newspaper. A silent housekeeper would place the food before him and remove it without a word. He was not allowed to explore the property and spent most of his time in his room, staring out the window at the unforgiving expanse of the New Mexico desert. He felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of someone else's life, seen but never truly acknowledged. The crushing loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on his small chest and making it difficult to breathe. He was a child, drowning in a sea of adult indifference, and there was no one to pull him to shore. His only solace was a small, worn Bible that had belonged to his father. The leather cover was soft from years of use, and the pages were filled with his father's spidery handwriting in the margins. At night, under the faint light of the moon, Ezekiel would trace the familiar verses with his finger, mouthing the words his father had taught him. He wasn't just reading scripture, he was trying to hear his father's voice again, to feel the steadfastness of his faith. The book was a tangible link to everything he had lost, a relic from a world where God felt close and present, not distant and silent as he did in the judge's cold house. He would fall asleep with the book clutched to his chest, its familiar weight a small anchor in the vast emptiness of his new life. He missed his parents with an ache so profound it felt like a part of his own body had been amputated. He missed the easy way his father would laugh, a sound that could fill a room and make everything feel right. He missed the gentle touch of his mother's hand on his forehead when he was sick, her quiet strength a source of infinite comfort. In their absence, he felt unmoored, a ship without a sail or a rudder, tossed about on a storm of grief. The faith his father had so carefully instilled in him felt fragile now, a flickering candle flame in a powerful wind. He prayed every night, his words whispered into his pillow, but the prayers felt like stones dropped into a deep well, met only with silence. In the third week of his stay, the nature of the judge's interest in him began to shift. Ezekiel started noticing maps spread across the judge's large desk in the study, maps of the county with a specific 60-acre parcel circled in red ink, his land. He would overhear snippets of conversations with well-dressed men who came to visit, words like railroad, deed, and title. The judge began asking him questions about the property, not with any warmth, but with the pointed precision of a lawyer. He wanted to know about water sources, about boundaries, about any other family who might have a claim. Ezekiel, though only a boy, understood that this was not concern. It was a form of interrogation. He was not a ward to be cared for, but a puzzle to be solved, a lock for which the judge was seeking a key. He remembered a lesson his father had taught him one sweltering afternoon while they were fixing a fence on that very land. His father had pointed to a hawk circling high above. "God provides for all his creatures, Ezekiel," he had said, his voice serious. "Even in the harshest places, there is life. There is water. You just have to be humble enough to see the signs he leaves for you. The land speaks to those who listen." At the time, they were just words, part of the endless tapestry of faith his father wove into everyday life. Now, in the cold silence of the judge's house, the memory felt like a premonition, a piece of a story whose ending he could not yet see, but which filled him with a quiet sense of dread. The end of his passive suffering and the beginning of his active trial came on a Monday evening. Judge Blackwood called him into the study, the room smelling of old leather and cigar smoke. The man did not ask Ezekiel to sit. He stood behind his desk, his fingers steepled, and looked at the boy with an unnerving placidity. He spoke of faith, of how true belief is forged in the crucible of hardship. He said that Ezekiel's father was a man of great faith, and that it was time to see if that faith had taken root in his son. He spoke of a journey, a test of spirit that would take place on the boy's own inherited land. The words were cloaked in the language of the Bible, but the judge's eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. Ezekiel felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. That night, Ezekiel couldn't sleep. He stood at his window, looking out at the vast, dark expanse of the desert stretching out to the horizon, a silhouette of jagged rock and sparse brush under a canopy of brilliant, indifferent stars. This was the landscape that had taken his parents. It was the land that held his inheritance, and it was the place where the judge intended to send him for his test. For the first time, the full weight of his situation settled upon him. He was not just an orphan, he was an obstacle. And he understood with the simple, brutal clarity of a child that Judge Blackwood did not intend for him to come back. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone, facing a wilderness that had already proven its power to destroy. The journey began under the oppressive glare of a Tuesday morning sun. Judge Blackwood drove the buggy himself, a rare occurrence that filled the air with a tense, unspoken significance. They traveled for what felt like hours, leaving behind the last vestiges of settlement and plunging deep into the arid heart of the territory. The landscape grew increasingly hostile with every mile, a panorama of cracked earth, skeletal creosote bushes, and jagged rock formations that shimmered under the heat. Ezekiel sat in silence, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap, the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves a monotonous drumbeat, marking their progress toward an unknown destination. The judge did not speak a single word, his profile a rigid silhouette against the vast, empty sky. His silence was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, and with each passing moment, the boy's apprehension solidified into a cold, hard knot of fear in his stomach. This was not a trip of inspection. It was a procession. They finally came to a stop in a place that seemed to be the very definition of desolation. It was a wide, flat expanse of sun-baked alkali soil, 40 miles from anything that could be called a town. There were no trees for shade, no sign of an arroyo that might hold water, only the relentless, shimmering heat rising from the ground in visible waves. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down, seemingly intent on scorching the very life from the land. Judge Blackwood methodically tied the reins, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were officiating a solemn ceremony. He moved with a chilling lack of urgency, a man entirely in control of the elements and the fate of the small boy beside him. He looked out over the barren 60 acres, Ezekiel's land, with an expression of cold appraisal, the look of a man calculating the value of an empty, silent room. The judge stepped down from the buggy, the dust barely stirring around his polished boots. He turned and looked up at Ezekiel, his face unreadable, and offered a hand to help him down. The gesture was so devoid of warmth, it felt like a mockery of kindness, a procedural step in a transaction the boy was only just beginning to comprehend. From the back of the buggy, the judge produced 2 items. The first was a metal canteen which he shook once, producing a faint, hollow, sloshing sound that spoke of near emptiness. The second was a thin wool blanket, a paltry defense against the frigid temperatures the desert would offer once the sun abandoned the sky. He held them out, not as provisions, but as props, the essential tools for the final act of a play that had been written long before this day. Ezekiel took them, his fingers numb, the light weight of the canteen, a terrifying confirmation of his vulnerability. Then the judge began to speak, his voice as dry and dispassionate as the land around them. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. The crushing silence of the desert amplified every word into a pronouncement. He spoke of faith, twisting the very words Ezekiel's father had used into a cruel parody. He called this a test, a crucible designed to forge the boy's spirit, to see if the preacher's belief had truly been passed down to his son. He framed the abandonment as a spiritual opportunity, a chance for Ezekiel to prove the existence of the God his father had so fervently preached about. The words were cloaked in the sacred language of the pulpit, a veneer of piety over an act of profound and calculated cruelty. All the while, His eyes remained fixed on the boy, holding no pity, only the cold, detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. Ezekiel listened, his mind struggling to process the monstrous logic of the judge's speech. At first, there was only confusion. This had to be a lesson, a strange and terrifying parable meant to teach him something. But as the judge continued, the meaning became horribly, undeniably clear. The boy's gaze darted from the judge's hard face to the empty horizon, searching for some sign that this was not real, that someone would appear and put a stop to this madness. He felt a wave of nausea, and the world seemed to tilt, the heat and the man's calm, level voice merging into a surreal nightmare. He looked for a flicker of humanity in the judge's eyes, a hint of mercy, but found nothing. There was only the unyielding finality of a decision already made, a sentence already passed down from a bench of one. The true nature of the threat was then laid bare, stripped of its religious pretense. Judge Blackwood explained, with the precision of a lawyer outlining a contract, exactly what would happen next. In a matter of days, he would ride to the county seat and file a report. He would declare that the orphan, Ezekiel James Thornton, had wandered off into the wilderness and become tragically lost. He would express his profound sorrow. He would then, as the boy's legal guardian, petition the court to declare the property abandoned, clearing the legal path for the county to assume control. The words were a death sentence delivered not with a weapon, but with the cold, sharp edge of the law. Ezekiel understood with a clarity that cut through his fear. He was being erased from the world, his life and his legacy to be wiped away by a signature on a piece of paper. The judge concluded his pronouncement by pressing the nearly empty canteen into Ezekiel's hands. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a tone of chilling intimacy. "Your father believed in a God who provides," he said, his breath smelling faintly of licorice. He believed that faith was a shield against the wilderness of this world. Now is your chance to see if he was right. He placed a hand briefly on Ezekiel's shoulder, a gesture not of comfort, but of dismissal. Then he delivered the final damning benediction, the words that would echo in Ezekiel's mind for the next 3 days. "If your God exists," the judge declared, his eyes as empty as the desert sky, "let him care for you." With that, the transaction was complete. Judge Blackwood turned without another word, climbed back into his buggy and untied the reins. He did not look back. The squeak of the wheels and the steady clop of the horse's hooves were the only sounds in the vast, silent world. Ezekiel stood frozen, watching as the buggy grew smaller and smaller, a shrinking black speck against the shimmering horizon, until it was finally swallowed by the heat and the distance. He was left entirely alone, a 10-year-old boy holding a useless blanket and a canteen containing little more than a mouthful of water, facing a 40-mile expanse of rock and sun. The silence that rushed in to fill the void, left by the departing buggy, was absolute and terrifying. It was the sound of his own death approaching. He remained motionless for a long time, the full, crushing weight of his reality settling upon him. This was not a test of faith. It was a murder, carefully orchestrated to look like a tragedy. The judge had not just abandoned him, he had sentenced him to be consumed by the very land that was his birthright. The sun beat down on his head, and the thirst that was already beginning to parch his throat was a grim reminder that his time was measured in hours, not days. The world had been reduced to this single brutal fact. He was a child, utterly alone, and no one was coming for him. The period of waiting, of quiet suffering in the judge's house, was over. The trial had begun. For the first hour, Ezekiel did not move. He stood as a small solitary statue in the immense shimmering heat, his mind a hollow chamber where the judge's final words echoed without end. "If your God exists, let him care for you." The phrase was not a challenge, it was a curse, an abdication of all human responsibility. The initial shock, a paralyzing disbelief that any man could be so deliberately cruel, slowly receded, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. To stay here in this spot was to obey the judge's command. It was to wait patiently for the sun and the thirst to carry out the sentence. It was to die. A tremor ran through his small frame, a jolt of pure, primal instinct. He would not die here. He would not grant Aldous Blackwood the satisfaction of a quiet, convenient tragedy. The decision was not born of courage or of faith, but of a simple, defiant refusal. He would not be erased. His father's voice, a memory so vivid it was almost a sound, broke through the paralyzing silence of the desert. He remembered a summer afternoon, mending a fence under this same relentless sun, when his father had wiped the sweat from his brow and pointed to a line of distant cottonwoods. "Water is life, son," he had said, his voice practical, not preachy. "And life is smart. It doesn't fight the land. It finds a way. Animals know. The shape of the ground knows. You follow the low places, Ezekiel. You watch the birds. The land will always tell you its secrets if you're humble enough to listen." The memory was not a comfort. It was a tool. It was the first piece of a map. A set of instructions left behind not by a preacher, but by a man who understood the unforgiving language of this territory. His father had given him the knowledge to survive. The judge had given him the reason. The plan that formed in his 10-year-old mind was brutally simple. He could not walk the 40 miles back to town. The judge had made sure of that. His only chance, his only hope, was to find water here on his own land. He looked down at his meager provisions. The wool blanket, useless now, would be essential when the temperature plummeted after sunset. The canteen held perhaps 2 mouthfuls of water. He knew with a chilling certainty that he could not afford to drink it yet. Thirst was a patient enemy, and he would need to be more patient still. He would have to travel at night, using the stars for direction as his father had taught him, and rest during the crushing heat of the day. His survival would be measured in single, deliberate actions, each one a small victory against the vast indifference of the wilderness. He took his first step, then another, his legs stiff and uncertain. He moved away from the open flatland, his eyes scanning the cracked earth for any feature that broke the monotony. A short distance away, a small cluster of rocks offered a sliver of shade, a shallow overhang barely large enough for him to huddle beneath. This would be his sanctuary until dusk. Reaching it, he slid into the narrow shadow, the heated rock pressing against his back. He unscrewed the cap of the canteen, lifted it to his lips, and allowed just enough water to wet his tongue and throat before forcing himself to stop. The act was a declaration of war. He was no longer a passive victim waiting for his fate. He was a survivor, rationing his resources, making his first strategic decision in a battle for his own life. The point of no return had been passed, not when the judge left, but in this moment, with this single disciplined sip. From his sliver of shade, the desert became a textbook he had to learn to read instantly. He forced himself to ignore the shimmering heat and the growing ache in his belly. Instead, he observed. He watched the way a hawk circled in the far distance, its pattern not random but focused, a potential sign of life below. He studied the ground, looking for the faintest depression in the land, the ghost of a wash or an arroyo that might, even when dry, hold moisture deeper down. He followed the slow crawl of a lizard across the rocks, noting its path. These were the signs his father had spoken of, the subtle language of a world that seemed empty, but was teeming with a hidden, desperate life. He was no longer just a boy. He was a student, and his classroom was an execution chamber. He had to learn faster than the sun could kill him. As the afternoon wore on, the initial surge of defiant energy began to wane, and a profound, terrifying loneliness set in. The sheer scale of the silence was a physical presence, pressing in on him from all sides. Doubt, a cold and insidious whisper, began to creep into his thoughts. What was he, a 10-year-old boy, against all of this? His father's lessons seemed like fables told in a safe and distant world. The judge's cold, confident face swam in his memory, the certainty in his eyes that this venture would fail. For a moment, despair washed over him, a temptation to simply lie down and let the end come. But then he remembered the man's final mocking words about God. The thought of the judge winning, of his own death proving the man right, ignited a spark of anger that burned hotter than the sun. That anger became his fuel, a righteous fury that chased the fear back into the shadows. The sun finally touched the western horizon, and the sky began to bleed into shades of orange and purple. The oppressive heat began to lift, replaced by a creeping chill in the air. This was his signal. It was time to move. He stood up, his joints aching, and wrapped the thin wool blanket around his shoulders. It felt less like a comfort and more like armor. He looked to the north toward the faint, familiar shape of a distant butte his father had once pointed out to him. That would be his bearing. He took one last look back at the empty expanse where the buggy had disappeared, a silent farewell to the life that had been stolen from him. Then he turned his face toward the growing darkness, toward the unknown, and began to walk. Each step was an act of faith, not in a distant God, but in the lessons of a loving father and in the stubborn, unyielding refusal of a child to simply vanish. The first night descended not as a blanket of comfort, but as a vast cold void. With the sun gone, the desert's stored heat bled away into the atmosphere with shocking speed, and a deep, penetrating chill began to seep into Ezekiel's bones. He pulled the thin wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, a meager shield against the immense emptiness. Above him, the sky was a spray of crystalline stars, so bright and close they seemed to hum. He found the North Star, a fixed point of certainty in a world that had dissolved into chaos. His father had taught him how to find it, a simple lesson in navigation that had now become his single most important piece of knowledge. He fixed his eyes on it and began to walk, his steps small and deliberate on the uneven ground. The initial defiant anger that had propelled him away from his point of abandonment now cooled into a grim, focused resolve. Survival was no longer an idea, it was a rhythm, the crunch of his boots on gravel, the whisper of the wind, the steady beat of his own determined heart. He walked for what felt like an eternity, the landscape a monotonous parade of dark, hulking shapes under the starlight. After the first hour, a new kind of fear began to set in. Every rock formation looked the same, every shallow dip in the earth a twin to the one before it. The North Star was his guide, but the terrain directly in front of him was a confusing, treacherous maze. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of his resolve. Was he walking in circles, wasting his precious, dwindling energy on a path that led nowhere? He forced himself to stop, his breathing coming in ragged bursts. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the disorienting shadows and remember another of his father's lessons. When you're lost, son, be still. The world keeps moving, but the truth doesn't. He stood utterly motionless, letting the silence and the cold wash over him until the frantic beating of his heart slowed to a steady, rhythmic thump. Opening his eyes, he ignored the intimidating shapes and focused only on the ground. He looked for the subtle signs of a wash, a place where water might have once flowed, knowing it would naturally lead to lower ground. He found it a few yards to his left, a barely perceptible channel of sand and smoother pebbles cutting through the sharper rock. It was a small discovery, a minor victory in a war of attrition, but it felt monumental. Following this faint, ghostly path, the walking became marginally easier, the ground more forgiving under his worn boots. He was not just wandering blindly, he was reading the land, interpreting its secrets, using the knowledge his father had given him as both a map and a shield. This small success was a sip of water for his flagging spirit, renewing the fragile determination that was keeping him moving, keeping him alive in the face of an indifferent wilderness. The silence of the night was suddenly shattered by a sound that made every muscle in his body clench. A long, mournful howl echoed from the distant mesas, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. A coyote. Then another answered, closer this time. He froze mid-stride, his blood turning to ice in his veins. In the daylight he knew they were wary creatures, but here in the vast, concealing darkness, they were transformed by his imagination into hungry phantoms. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. Every gust of wind sounded like a padded footfall. The primal fear of being hunted, of being prey, rooted him to the spot. His carefully constructed wall of resolve crumbled, and for a long moment he was just a small, terrified boy, utterly alone and defenseless in a world of teeth and claws. He stood there, paralyzed, for a full minute, his mind screaming at him to run, though he knew there was nowhere to go. Then his trembling hand found the small leather-bound Bible in his coat pocket. The familiar feel of the worn cover was a solid anchor in the swirling vortex of his fear. He didn't open it. He just held it, the weight of it a tangible connection to his father, to a faith that spoke of sparrows and lilies, of a God who saw all. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air burning his lungs. The coyotes were not monsters, they were just creatures of this land, surviving as he was. The thought did not erase the fear, but it contained it. He took one step, then another, his movements stiff and robotic at first, pushing through the thick wall of his terror and forcing his body to obey his will. Hours later, the moon finally crested the eastern horizon, bathing the desert in a pale, ethereal glow. The silver light was a blessing and a curse. It allowed him to see the path ahead more clearly, to avoid the treacherous loose rocks and thorny brush, but it also revealed the crushing, unending vastness of the landscape. The horizon seemed no closer than it had at sunset. He felt a profound, soul-deep weariness settle over him, a weight far heavier than the blanket on his shoulders. His concentration lapsed for just a second. His foot caught on an exposed root, and he pitched forward, landing hard on the gravelly ground. A sharp, searing pain shot through his right knee and the palms of his hands. He gritted his teeth to stifle a cry, the sound swallowed by the immense silence. The world swam before his eyes, and for a moment he thought he might simply lie there and let the cold take him. Before he even registered the pain in his knee, his first panicked thought was of the canteen. He scrambled to find it, his scraped hands fumbling in the dark. It had flown from his grasp when he fell, landing with a dull thud a few feet away. He snatched it up, his heart pounding. He shook it gently and was met with the faint, reassuring slosh of the water inside. It was not broken. The dent in its side was a small price to pay. The wave of relief that washed over him was so powerful, it left him dizzy. He sat on the cold ground, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, the sting of his raw hands a distant, secondary concern. He knew he couldn't rest long. The cold was a patient predator, and to remain still was to invite it in. He had survived the fall, but the desert had left its mark on him. He pushed himself back to his feet, his right leg protesting with a fresh, sharp ache. His walk was now a hobble, each step a carefully negotiated truce with the pain. The desert night was alive with a secret, subtle symphony of sounds he had never noticed before. The dry, rustling whisper of the wind through the creosote bushes, the faint, frantic skittering of a kangaroo rat darting between rocks, the impossibly distant hoot of an owl. The air itself had a smell, a clean, sharp fragrance of dust and desert herbs that was both invigorating and desolate. He focused on these sensations, on the physical reality of his surroundings, using them as a mantra to keep his mind from dwelling on the pain in his knee, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, and the profound, crushing weight of his solitude. He was a single, moving point of warmth and life in a vast, cold, and indifferent universe. The thirst, which had been a quiet companion, now became a loud, insistent tormentor. His tongue felt thick and dry, his throat a raw, rasping passage. The desire to upend the canteen and pour its entire contents down his throat was a physical craving, a siren call promising a moment of blissful relief. But he resisted. He unscrewed the cap and allowed himself a single, measured swallow, just enough to wet his mouth before forcing the cap back on. The act required a level of self-control that felt superhuman. Each drop was a strategic resource in a battle where the stakes were absolute. He was no longer just a boy. He was a general commanding an army of one, and his only ammunition was this last bit of water and the fading echoes of his father's wisdom. His survival depended entirely on his ability to deny his own screaming instincts. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of grey and rose, he knew he had to find shelter. The rising sun was not a symbol of hope. It was his primary enemy, a relentless force that would bake the life out of him if he were caught in its direct gaze. He spotted a jumble of large boulders that offered a deep, dark shadow. He half stumbled, half crawled into the narrow space, the cool rock a welcome relief against his feverish skin. He had survived the first night. He had walked for miles, faced down fear, and endured pain. He wrapped the blanket around himself, not for warmth now, but as a shield against the coming light. He closed his eyes, and despite the pain and the thirst, a deep and profound exhaustion pulled him down into a restless, dream-filled sleep. The second day was a waking nightmare spent in a state of suspended animation. The sun climbed the sky, turning his rocky shelter into an oven. The heat was a physical entity, pressing down on him, stealing the moisture from his breath. He dared not move, conserving every ounce of energy. The world outside his sliver of shade was a shimmering white-hot haze. Thirst was no longer a feeling. It was the entirety of his existence. He found a small barrel cactus nearby and, remembering a story his father once told, broke off a spine and licked the tiny beads of morning dew from its waxy skin. The moisture was almost non-existent, the taste bitter, but it was something. Later, driven by desperation, he used a sharp rock to dig in the sandy bottom of a dry wash. His father's words about following the low places a desperate fading prayer. He dug until his raw fingers bled, but the earth offered up only more dust, dry and lifeless. When dusk finally returned, bringing with it a blessed coolness, he knew he had to move again. He pushed himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. His movements were sluggish, his limp more pronounced. The resolve that had burned so brightly the night before had been baked into a dull, fragile ember. He set out under the stars once more, but this time there was no sense of purpose, only the mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other. Sometime after midnight, he took the final swallow of water from the canteen. He held it to his lips, tilting it back until the last drop was gone. The silence that followed, the absence of that sloshing sound, was a death knell. He lowered the empty container, its lightness a terrifying symbol of his own emptiness. A cold, stark realization settled over him. He would not survive a third day. His body gave out near dawn on the third day. He had been walking for hours, a shambling, semi-conscious journey toward a horizon that never drew closer. His legs tangled beneath him, and he fell to the ground, not with a crash, but with a soft, final surrender. He didn't have the strength to even try to get up. He simply lay on his back, his arms spread wide, and stared up at the fading stars. The world was utterly silent, utterly still. The anger was gone. The fear was gone. All that remained was a profound and encompassing weariness. This was the end. A strange, unexpected peace settled over him. He was not on the judge's land or his father's land. He was simply on the earth, under the sky. He closed his eyes and whispered the words into the vast, silent darkness. A final message to the God his father had promised was always there. "If you want to take me, Lord," he breathed, his voice a dry rasp, "at least I am not alone." Believing it was his final prayer, he let go, and the world dissolved into blackness. He awoke not to silence, but to a sound. It was a dry, insistent scratching, a rhythmic scraping that cut through the profound stillness of the dawn. For a moment, suspended in the hazy space between deathly sleep and consciousness, he thought it was the sound of his own heart, a final ragged beat against the earth. But the sound was outside of him. With an effort that felt like lifting stone, he raised his head, his vision swimming. A few yards away, under the soft grey light of the emerging sun, a family of coyotes was digging. There were 3 of them, 2 adults and a pup, and they were not hunting or playing. They were working, their paws a blur of focused energy, kicking up dust from a patch of ground that looked no different from the miles of barren earth surrounding it. There was no menace in their presence, only a strange and inexplicable industry, an urgent purpose that held Ezekiel's wavering attention. A memory so clear and sudden it felt like a voice whispering on the wind, surfaced from the depths of his exhaustion. It was his father speaking on a hot afternoon long ago, his words a simple statement of fact. God speaks through his creatures, Ezekiel, to those who know how to listen. The words landed in his mind not as a comforting platitude, but as a direct and urgent instruction. The coyotes. They were not a random occurrence. They were not a threat. They were a sign, an answer to the prayer he had whispered into the darkness before surrendering. A current of strength, one that did not feel like his own, moved through his limbs. This was not the end. It was a summons. He had been shown a path, and he understood with a bone-deep certainty that he was meant to follow it, to see where their strange work led. He began to crawl. The movement was agonizing, a slow, painful drag of his body across the sharp gravel. Every muscle screamed in protest. his scraped knee leaving a faint trail in the dust. The coyotes stopped their digging as he approached. They watched him, their intelligent amber eyes showing no fear, no aggression. They simply observed his slow, desperate pilgrimage toward them. When he was only a few feet away, the largest of the three let out a soft yip, and as if their task was completed, they turned and trotted away, melting back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared. They left behind a shallow depression in the earth, a place of disturbed soil that now held a significance far greater than its simple appearance suggested. They had not fled from him. They had made way for him, leaving him alone with the secret they had been sent to unearth. He reached the spot and collapsed beside it, his breath coming in shallow, burning gasps. He began to dig, first with his raw and bleeding hands, scooping away the loose dirt the coyotes had excavated. The soil was dry, just like everywhere else. For a terrifying moment, doubt flooded his mind. Had he imagined it all? Was this just another fever dream, a final cruel trick played by his dehydrated brain? The despair was a physical weight, threatening to crush the last ember of hope. But then his fingers brushed against a sharp-edged rock. He grasped it, the stone fitting into his palm like a tool made for this very purpose. He ignored the pain as the rock bit into his torn skin and began to hack at the harder-packed earth below, his movements clumsy but driven by a singular, desperate focus. Then it happened. His fingers, probing the bottom of the shallow hole, broke through the dry crust and touched something else. It was cool, it was damp. The sensation was so impossible, so utterly alien to the world of heat and dust he had inhabited for 3 days, that he snatched his hand back as if burned. He stared at his fingertips, now coated with a dark, rich soil. He cautiously reached back into the hole, pressing his palm flat against the source of the coolness. It was real. A wave of disbelief and a fragile, burgeoning hope washed over him, so powerful it made him dizzy. The land was not dead here. Deep beneath the sun-baked surface, hidden from the world, there was life. This was not a delusion. It was a promise, whispered from the heart of the earth itself. A new, frantic energy surged through him. He abandoned the rock and clawed at the damp earth with both hands, the coolness of it a balm on his raw skin. The dry dust gave way to thick, dark mud, a substance so precious it felt like treasure. The smell of it filled his nostrils, the clean, life-giving scent of wet earth, a fragrance he thought he would never experience again. He dug with a primal urgency, scooping out handfuls of the miraculous soil, his mind empty of everything but this one task. The hole deepened, no longer a shallow scrape, but a small dark wound in the desert floor. It was a wound, however, that did not bleed death, but one that was about to offer up the very essence of life, a hidden pulse beating just beneath the surface of a world he had believed was entirely barren. It was not a gush or a flood, but a quiet, unassuming miracle. A trickle of clear, cold water began to seep into the bottom of the hole, pooling in the impression his hands had made. He watched, mesmerized, as the trickle became a steady welling, the water pushing aside the mud as it rose. A single, perfect bubble broke the surface. Then another. The dawn light caught the small growing pool, making it shimmer like a collection of captured stars. The sound of it, a soft, bubbling whisper, was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. It was the sound of a promise being kept, of a prayer being answered in a language more profound than words. The desert had held this secret, this life, waiting for him to be humble enough, desperate enough to see it. He did not hesitate. He plunged his face into the small, muddy spring, the shock of the cold water on his sun-scorched skin, a jolt that seemed to restart his heart. He drank with a desperation that bordered on violence, gulping down the life-giving liquid, not even registering the taste of mud and earth. He drank until his shrunken stomach cramped and ached in protest, forcing him to pull back, gasping. The water was the coldest, purest thing he had ever tasted. It was more than just hydration. It was a cleansing, washing away not only the dust and the thirst, but the deep, soul-crushing despair that had taken root over the past 3 days. He had been empty, and now, in the most literal and profound sense, he was being filled. The relief was so absolute, so overwhelming that his body could no longer support him. He collapsed onto the wet ground beside the water, the cool mud a welcome cradle for his exhausted frame. and then the sobs came. They were not the sounds of sorrow or of pain, but of a gratitude so profound it felt like a holy presence settling over him. Tears streamed down his dirty face, mixing with the water and mud, each one a testament to his survival. He wept for the father whose faith had proven true, for the creatures who had guided him, and for the God who had not, in the end, abandoned him. He had been left to die by man, but he had been answered by a power far greater, one that could command the coyotes and make water spring from the driest of lands. He lay there for a long time, listening to the gentle bubbling of the spring, a sound that was now the center of his entire world. The rising sun, once his greatest enemy, now seemed to cast a warm, benevolent light on the scene. This small patch of wet earth was his refuge, his sanctuary, a place where the cruelty of the world could not touch him. He was safe, he was alive. And in the profound silence of the New Mexico morning, surrounded by the evidence of an impossible miracle, he understood with perfect soul-shaking clarity that his trial was over. He had been tested not to see if he would break, but to see if he would listen. And in his darkest hour, he had heard the voice of God in the scratching paws of a coyote. Weeks after his ordeal, the world returned to Ezekiel, not with comfort, but with the clatter of wagons and the voices of strangers. They were surveyors, led by a man named Solomon Hartley, a chief engineer whose face was weathered by the sun, but whose eyes held a keen and assessing light. They had been mapping a path for the railroad, a great iron artery that would change the territory forever, and their work had brought them to a dead end. Their steam-powered machinery was useless without a consistent source of water, and for 40 miles in every direction, the land was unforgivingly dry. They came to Ezekiel's small camp by the spring, not as a rescue party, but as men seeking a resource, their interest purely practical. They found a boy, thin and scarred, but with a stillness in his eyes that spoke of things he should not know at 10 years old, sitting beside a bubbling spring that, according to all their maps, simply should not exist. Mr. Hartley was a direct man, his questions unadorned with pity. He asked about the spring, its depth, its flow, its reliability. Ezekiel answered in simple, quiet sentences, explaining that it had never run dry. The engineer and his men measured and tested, their initial skepticism giving way to professional astonishment. Hartley unrolled a large map across the hood of his wagon, its surface a web of precise lines and elevations. He showed Ezekiel the proposed route for the railroad, a bold red line that cut directly through the 60 acres Judge Blackwood now claimed. Then, with a thick finger, he tapped a spot a half-mile away from the red line. It was the spring. It was Ezekiel's land. He explained, in the practical language of his trade, that without access to this water, the entire route was unworkable. The engine needed to drink, and this was the only well in 100 square miles. A slow, profound understanding began to dawn in Ezekiel's mind. The land the judge had chosen as his tomb, the desolate patch of earth meant to consume him and erase his name, was now the single most critical piece of property in the entire region. The irony was so immense, so divinely orchestrated, that it was almost too much for his young mind to grasp. Solomon Hartley, seeing the look on the boy's face, began to sense that the story of this spring was deeper than geology. His questions shifted from the water to the boy himself. He asked how he came to be here alone. He inquired about his parents and about his legal guardian, Judge Blackwood. As Ezekiel recounted the story of the flood and the judge's subsequent test of faith, a dark and terrible suspicion began to form in the engineer's clear eyes. Hartley was not a man to let suspicion lie dormant. He rode to the county seat himself, his purpose no longer just about the railroad, but about the quiet, resilient boy he had left by the impossible spring. He spent 2 days in the dusty archives of the courthouse, his engineer's mind for detail now focused on legal documents instead of topography. He found what he was looking for, and more. The custody papers for Ezekiel James Thornton were there, signed and sealed by the judge himself. But Hartley also found records of 7 other children, all orphaned by accident or illness over the past decade, all of whom had been briefly under the guardianship of Judge Blackwood, and all of whom had either run away or succumbed to the wilderness, leaving their small parcels of land to be absorbed by the county and later purchased for pennies on the dollar by shell companies linked back to the judge. He returned to Ezekiel with a gravity that filled the small camp with a solemn air. He laid out the documents he had copied, his movements deliberate. He showed Ezekiel the deed to his father's land, the signature familiar and strong, even in memory. Then he placed the custody papers beside it. He pointed to the name, Aldous Blackwood, Guardian, and then to the line where his father's name should have been, confirming the transfer of wardship. But it was a clumsy, inexact forgery, a tracing of a dead man's hand. The cold, mechanical script was a mockery of his father's flowing penmanship. It was a lie committed to paper, the legal weapon that was meant to finalize the boy's erasure from the world. Seeing it, Ezekiel felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the desert night. Mr. Hartley explained it all then, the full, monstrous scope of the judge's greed. He explained how the man had preyed on the territory's most vulnerable, using the law as a predator uses its camouflage. He connected the pattern, the convenient tragedies, the abandoned properties that always fell into the judge's hands. Ezekiel was not the first. He was only the first to survive the final, brutal step of the scheme. The boy listened, his gaze fixed on the forged signature. He was not just an inconvenience to the judge, he was the culmination of a long and bloody career of theft and almost of murder. The knowledge was a physical weight, settling on his small shoulders, but it was not a crushing one. Instead, it was clarifying. It was the final piece of a puzzle he had been living inside of. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. He was 7 years old, standing on this very land with his father. A man had ridden up and offered to buy the property, calling it worthless, sun-scorched rock. His father had politely refused. When the man was gone, his father had placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Never sell the land, Ezekiel. A man needs a place to stand that is his own. This may not look like much, but it is your foundation. God will make of it what he will." At the time, they were just words. Now they were a prophecy fulfilled. His father had not bought a piece of desert. He had bought a battlefield. He had purchased the very ground upon which his son's life would be saved, and his own legacy vindicated. The full, staggering truth of his father's love landed on him then. It was a love that had planned for a future it would not see, a faith that had provided a tangible inheritance. The spring was not a random miracle. It was the answer to a lifetime of prayers, a provision left for him, hidden in the earth, waiting for him to be desperate enough to find it. His parents had not abandoned him in their death. They had armed him. They had given him the knowledge to read the land, the faith to endure the trial, and the deed to the one place on earth that could not only save his life, but also bring a powerful, wicked man to justice. He was the living, breathing proof of their foresight and their unwavering belief. The tears that came this time were different from the ones he shed on the day he found the water. Those had been tears of relief, of pure animal survival. These were tears of understanding. He wept for the father he missed with every fiber of his being, a man whose wisdom had reached across the veil of death to guide his son's hands. He wept for the mother whose gentle strength he now felt inside himself. He cried not because he was alone, but because he finally, truly understood that he had never been. Every lesson, every scripture, every moment of love had been a stone laid in the foundation his father had spoken of. And on that foundation, he had not just survived, he had been saved. Solomon Hartley and his wife, Doña Esperanza, who had joined her husband, watched the boy weep. They did not interrupt. They stood as silent witnesses to a moment of profound and holy catharsis. Esperanza, a woman of deep and quiet faith, saw not an orphan, but a child touched by the hand of God, a living testament to a power that worked in ways men could not comprehend. She saw the miracle not just in the water that sprang from the dry ground, but in the unbreakable spirit of the boy who had been led to it. In that moment, she knew their lives were about to change, that their path had converged with this child's for a reason far greater than the laying of railroad ties. Ezekiel finally looked up, his face streaked with dirt and tears, but his eyes were clear. The confusion and fear were gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty. Judge Blackwood had left him with a challenge. "If your God exists, let him care for you." The boy now knew the answer. God had cared for him. He had used the love of his parents, the lessons of his father, the instincts of his wild creatures, and the greed of the judge himself to weave a tapestry of perfect, undeniable justice. The man had meant to steal 60 acres of worthless rock, but in doing so, he had delivered unto his victim the very key to his own destruction. The territorial trial of Judge Aldous Blackwood was a swift and brutal affair. The evidence was irrefutable. Solomon Hartley's testimony, the meticulously documented land records, the damning forgery on the custody papers, and the sudden, miraculous appearance of a spring on land the judge had declared abandoned all painted a picture of calculated, monstrous greed. When stories of the other 7 orphans came to light, public sentiment turned from shock to fury. The judge, who had built a reputation on piety and law, was exposed as a predator, who used both as weapons against the helpless. He was a man who had wrapped his wickedness in the robes of righteousness, and the territory would not forgive it. His conviction for fraud and the attempted murder of a child was a formality. The sentence was not. On a cold November morning, Judge Aldous Blackwood was hanged in the public square, his life ending at the end of a rope, a stark and public finality to his reign of quiet terror. For Ezekiel, there was no triumph in the man's death, only a quiet, somber sense of closure. Justice had been done. The world had been set right again. The shadow that had loomed over his young life had finally, irrevocably, been banished by the light. In the aftermath, Solomon and Esperanza Hartley did what their hearts had told them to do from the moment they saw the boy weeping by the spring. They legally adopted Ezekiel, welcoming him not as a ward but as a son. The sterile, silent mansion of the judge was replaced by a warm, noisy adobe home filled with the smell of roasting chilies and the sound of Esperanza's gentle humming. For the first time since the flood, Ezekiel felt the profound and simple comfort of belonging. He had a family again. He had a home. He never sold the 60 acres. To him, the land was sacred, a testament to a faith that had been tested and found true. When he came of age, he used the considerable royalties from the railroad's water contract not for himself, but to fulfill the legacy his father had started. Beside the spring, he built a small, simple adobe chapel, its doors always open. He erected a public well, offering the life-giving water freely to any traveler, prospector, or native family that passed by, asking for nothing in return. He became a quiet pillar of the forgotten communities of the territory, a man who understood what it meant to be left for dead and to be given a second chance at life. At 24, he married a Navajo schoolteacher who shared his quiet faith and gentle spirit. They raised 6 children on that land, their laughter echoing in a place that had once known only desolate silence. Ezekiel lived to be 89 years old, a patriarch, not of wealth or of power, but of grace. He was a landmark in the territory, a man who had grown from the harsh soil of tragedy into a great sheltering tree. Through all those years, visitors and his own grandchildren would often ask him the same question as they stood by the ever-bubbling spring. They would ask how, as a boy of 10, he had managed to find water where generations of men had found only dust and rock. He would always smile, his eyes looking out toward the distant mesas as if seeing something only he could, and he would always give the same, simple answer. "I didn't find it," he would say, his voice soft with the conviction of a lifetime. "God showed the coyotes, and the coyotes showed me. I was just humble enough to pay attention."